A warrior who has outlasted hell itself has fallen into a universe that still believes in saving it. The air here smells of something other than brimstone, sweeter and stranger, a cosmos where the damned are bargained with, and the monstrous are occasionally redeemed, and mercy is the highest ambition of its greatest defenders. He has no ambition. He has only the work, and the work is the same work in every universe, and the demons of Warhammer 40,000 were merely the latest to learn what the demons of this new galaxy are about to. When a force that hell itself has learned to dread arrives in a universe that has never run out of hell to offer, the question is not whether the Marvel Universe will survive the collision. The question is whether it will survive what the collision teaches it about itself. The instruments in the outer sanctum of the Sanctum Sanctorum had been screaming for 11 minutes before Dr. Elias Ern finally set down his tea. He was not an inattentive man. He was, in the estimation of the Sanctum's senior staff, the most attentive man in the building, which was a distinction that carried weight in a building that housed 3 of the world's most obsessive arcanists and 1 living god who visited on Tuesdays. But the instruments in the outer sanctum screamed a great deal. They had been screaming for 15 years, since the day he had been assigned to this post, and in 15 years, Elias Orn had learned to categorize the quality of the screaming before he responded to it. There was the low, sustained wail of a disrupted ley line, common in Manhattan, which required documentation but no intervention. There was the sharp chirp of an unauthorized portal, also common, which required a call to the 3rd-floor desk and a level of irritation proportional to the portal's size. There was the grinding harmonic of infernal activity, which was the most common sound of all, because Mephisto's infrastructure in the northeastern United States was 40 years old and extensive, and produced the mystic equivalent of ambient noise simply by existing. He had learned to read the frequency of the screaming the way a physician reads a heartbeat, automatically, without stopping whatever else he was doing. So when the instruments screamed on this particular Tuesday evening, he let them scream for 11 minutes, while he finished a margin note in Kamaraji's 3rd volume on infernal plane topology, made a notation of his own in the margin below Kamaraji's, and only then, tea still in hand, did he rise and cross the room to see what the frequency indicated. He understood what he was looking at in approximately 4 seconds. He dropped the tea. The infernal plane monitoring matrix was a piece of work he had always admired from a technical standpoint. Wong had spent 8 months on it. It was a lattice of crystalline thought fiber, each strand calibrated to a specific dimensional frequency, the whole of it designed to provide continuous real-time readings of infernal plane activity across the entire northeastern seaboard. It was not a simple instrument. It was not supposed to be a simple instrument. Mephisto's infrastructure was not simple, and a simple instrument would have missed half of it. The matrix was delicate, precise, sensitive, and had never in 15 years of continuous operation produced a reading that it could not eventually quantify. It was now producing cascading error notifications that amounted, in plain language, to something is happening inside Mephisto's realm that we do not have numbers for. Not subtle activity, not edge of detection anomalies. The readings were so far outside the matrix's calibration parameters that the instrument was reporting its own failure to report them accurately. It was measuring something by measuring the shape of the hole it was leaving in the data, the way you measure a black hole by the light it bends, rather than the light it emits. And what the hole indicated, in the matrix's frantic approximations, was activity at a scale that the matrix had been calibrated to track but had never actually encountered at this magnitude. A scale that implied something inside Mephisto's realm was producing infernal extinguishments. Not one, not a handful. An ongoing sequence, rapid, rhythmic, each one registering as a discrete event, each one the termination of a demonic presence of significant tier. Something was killing Mephisto's court. Elias stood very still for a moment and processed this. Then the second reading resolved, and what it told him was so structurally impossible that his first instinct was matrix malfunction. It was telling him that the source of the activity was not demonic. The thing inside Mephisto's realm causing these extinguishments was not a demon, was not a rival infernal entity, was not a celestial interloper, was not a sorcerer, operating from outside the dimensional membrane. It was something that did not match any dimensional signature in the Vishanti's catalogue, which was the most comprehensive dimensional reference document in existence, and which had never, in Elias Urn's experience, failed to classify anything. This it could not classify. It could only measure its effect, which was that things were dying in Mephisto's realm, things that should have been unkillable by any conventional measure, and they were dying at a pace that the Matrix rendered as a steady, metronomic series of events. A rhythm, not frenzy. Not a battle, something closer to work. He reached for the communication amulet. "Outer sanctum to primary line," he said, with the careful precision of someone who had learned that the way you reported a thing shaped how seriously it was received. "I need Dr. Strange. I need him to understand, before he comes down, that I am not exaggerating and I am not experiencing instrument malfunction." A pause. Something is inside Mephisto's realm that the Matrix cannot classify, and Mephisto's court is being systematically eliminated. The response from the other end was a silence that lasted exactly 2 seconds. "Eliminated," the voice said, not skeptical, precise. "Killed," Elias said, "permanently. The substrate readings are not showing recovery activity. Whatever is being done to them, they are not coming back." Another silence. "Shorter this time. I'll get Strange," the voice said. Elias Orn turned back to the Matrix and watched the readings continue. Each event registered as a heat signature, a pressure spike, and then a terminal flat line in the dimensional monitoring. The flat lines were what made his hands cold. In 30 years of theory and 15 years of practice, he had seen demonic entities killed before. He had seen the readings of the Night of Fallen Stars, when a chaos shard had torn through the outer territories of Mephisto's domain and taken 5 mid-tier entities with it. He had documented the aftermath of 3 Blackheart excursions into the mortal plane, each of which had ended in Blackheart's temporary defeat and gradual reconstitution. Temporary, always temporary. Infernal entities died and reformed. It was the nature of infernal existence. Death was a process, not a destination. These readings were not showing a process. These readings were showing destinations, final ones. 37 of them and counting, each one a flat line that the substrate was not attempting to process back into existence, as if the substrate itself understood that the question of reconstitution was simply not applicable to what had been done. He counted. He stopped counting at 40. The door opened, and Dr. Strange came in, still pulling on his sling ring. 3 things happened in Mephisto's realm in the moments before the Doomslayer arrived. The first was that Mephisto himself, in his private audience chamber at the apex of his greatest spire, completed a transaction he had been engineering for 37 years. The soul belonged to a corporate attorney named Archibald Fenner, a man whose particular moral texture had been so richly developed over so many decades of conscious choice that Mephisto had tracked him with something approaching professional admiration. The contract was signed without being read. They never read it. That was the point. That had always been the point. The second was that Blackheart, Prince of Hell, entered the audience chamber uninvited to report an anomaly in the realm's eastern territories, a dimensional breach signature that was not matching anything in the infernal catalogue. Mephisto dismissed this. The eastern territories were always registering anomalies. Blackheart lingered, which was unusual. Blackheart did not linger after dismissal. He lingered because the signature was wrong, in a way he could not articulate, and the fact that he could not articulate it troubled him in a way that his pride prevented him from admitting directly. The third was that the ceiling of the outer throne room cracked. Not from seismic activity, not from the structural stresses that occasionally rippled through Mephisto's realm as the demon lord rearranged his infrastructure. The ceiling cracked because something struck it from above with sufficient force to fracture stone that had been hardened by 10,000 years of continuous infernal energy, and then the thing that had struck it stood up. The outer throne room was not empty. Mephisto maintained it as a matter of aesthetic preference, a standing assembly of mid-tier infernal nobility whose function was to make the room feel like what it was, which was the antechamber of something genuinely terrible. 43 entities, ranging from the merely formidable to the genuinely powerful, by the measures of their kind. They had been stationed here for varying lengths of time, some for decades, some for centuries, all of them reliable enough in their menace that Mephisto had stopped noticing them individually the way a person stops noticing furniture that has always been where it is. They all noticed the figure that stood up from the floor. The figure was not large by infernal standards. Blackheart stood taller. Mephisto, in his preferred form, dwarfed everything in the room. The figure was roughly 2 meters in height, armored in plates the color of deep ocean shadow, a dull green-gray that absorbed the infernal light rather than reflecting it. The armor was not pristine. It was the armor of something that had been doing this for a very long time, each gouge and stress fracture a record rather than a failing, a history preserved rather than a weakness acknowledged. The helmet was sealed, the face behind it invisible, but the posture was legible without a face. The posture communicated a single thing with perfect clarity: purpose, not rage, not aggression, not the theatrical menace that infernal nobility practiced as a professional art. The thing standing in the crater in the floor of Mephisto's outer throne room looked at the 43 entities assembled there and communicated, through posture alone, that it had assessed them and reached a conclusion, and the conclusion was the only one available to it. 5 seconds of silence. Then the Doomslayer moved. What happened in the next 40 seconds exists in Elias Orn's records as a sequence of instrument readings that took 8 pages of annotation to render comprehensible. 43 events, each one the termination of a demonic presence, each one registering as a distinct flat line in the substrate monitoring, arriving in a tempo that Elias would later describe, choosing his words very carefully, as the rhythm of someone working through a list. Not berserk, not ecstatic, not the frenzied violence of something that has lost control. The rhythm of deliberate labor, each extinguishment precise, each one the logical continuation of the one before it. 43 entities in 40 seconds. Blackheart arrived through the inner door to find an empty room. Not deserted, cleared. The armored figure in the center of it, facing him, unmoving, as if it had been waiting for the next item on the list to present itself. Blackheart was the Prince of Hell. He had absorbed the souls of the damned since before the first human civilization. He had grown into something that his own father regarded with something that was not quite wariness but was adjacent to respect. He had defeated, in his long existence, entities whose names were still spoken with fear in the higher infernal tiers. He was not accustomed to fear. He looked at the armored figure. He was afraid. "What?" he said. He did not finish the question, because the Doomslayer was already moving, and 61 seconds later, when the flat line registered in the outer sanctum's matrix, and the matrix itself began cascading error notifications because it had no protocol for what it was measuring, Blackheart was not in a condition to hear an answer. He was not in a condition at all. Mephisto heard it happen from 7 layers of hardened infernal architecture away, not as sound, as knowledge. The specific knowledge that a presence that had existed since before the Byzantine Empire, a presence that was his, that was part of his domain in the most direct sense, was no longer part of anything. He felt it the way one feels the sudden absence of a limb, not pain but wrongness, the specific wrongness of something being structurally absent that should be present. His monitoring altar confirmed it. His son was not dead. Death was something Mephisto understood, had wielded for 10 millennia, had turned into a commodity. This was not death. This was the removal of his son from the category of things that existed, and the altar, which was calibrated to his own consciousness and could measure things that Elias Orn's matrix could only approximate, was also telling him the precise character of what had done it. Not demonic, not divine, not arcane in any sense the Vishanti's frameworks could accommodate. Something from a cosmological structure so different from Earth 616 that its dimensional signature was not a signature at all, but an absence, a blank where a classification should be. Something that had been removed from a context his universe could categorize and was now operating without the constraints that context would have imposed. Something that killed the way this universe's oceans erode coastlines. Without malice, without preference. Simply because it was what it did, and this was where it was. Mephisto stacked his wards. every one he possessed, in a configuration he had not employed since the Chaos Wars, each layer reinforcing the one below it. He sealed himself in his inner sanctum with the absolute certainty of someone who had just encountered something he could not fight conventionally and understood this immediately. Then he waited. His realm was systematically cleared, not destroyed. The architecture persisted. The rivers of fire continued their ancient courses. The sky of Mephisto's realm, which was not a sky but a compressed ceiling of psychic suffering, remained intact. What moved through the realm's spaces, from the outer throne room through the first tier of infernal nobility, then the second, then the third, was not interested in the realm's structure. It was interested only in what the realm contained. It moved the way a searcher moves through a building, room by room, methodical, without reversal. The first tier fell in the time it took Elias on to reach for his communication amulet. The second tier took longer, not because the entities were more formidable, but because the architecture was denser, the spaces more complex, and the Doomslayer moved through complexity the way he moved through everything, without hesitation, adapting without pausing, the adjustment happening below the level of anything that would count as thought. The second tier's Lords of the Outer Ring assembled in the Great Hall, 6 of them, entities of genuine infernal power, beings who had served Mephisto since before the printing press, each one capable of laying waste to a mid-sized city through the application of their particular talents. They assembled every ward the realm could provide, formed a combined defensive configuration that the infernal strategic texts described as the Iron Rose, a formation specifically developed to contain and repel forces of catastrophic individual power. The Doomslayer walked into the Iron Rose. What the instruments recorded across the next 9 minutes defied Elias Orn's attempts at description. He wrote the reconstruction report 4 days after the event, after extensive recalibration of the entire monitoring matrix, and what he produced was not a narrative but a column of annotated measurements, each one a Lord's extinguishment timestamped to the second, accompanied by notes on the magnitude and character of the infernal energy displacement. He could not describe the combat itself. The instruments could not describe it. They could only describe its results, which were that 6 entities who had existed for longer than the current dominant civilization were gone, not killed in any recoverable sense, removed from the infernal substrate as thoroughly as if they had never been placed there. He added a note at the bottom of the report that read, "I have no analogy for the efficiency of this. I do not think an analogy exists in human experience." Below the third tier, the Doomslayer stopped. He stopped at the dimensional membrane separating Mephisto's realm from Earth 616, the boundary that Mephisto had been fortifying with continuous warding since before the Sorcerer Supreme tradition had formalized its own reinforcement on the other side. The membrane was what it was, the most heavily reinforced dimensional boundary in Earth 616 cosmology, centuries of layered protection from both sides. Not a door, a vault. The Doomslayer put his fist through the vault. The breach was not clean. It was not meant to be. It was not elegant or precise or considerate of the dimensional engineering that had gone into the vault's construction. It was a hole made by a thing that needed a hole. In the outer sanctum of the Sanctum Sanctorum, every instrument Elias Orn had ever calibrated registered the event as an impact, a dimensional pressure event of a magnitude that the instruments could not have been designed to track because the magnitude exceeded the design assumptions by a factor that should not have been achievable without a celestial or greater intervention. Every instrument registered it, and then every instrument broke, not because they were poorly made, but because they were made for a universe that did not contain whatever had just done that. Elias Orn sat in a room full of broken instruments and looked at the space where the readings had been and said, very quietly, "Strange, he's out." The breach opened above the intersection of 9th Avenue and West 49th Street at 9:47 on a Tuesday evening. Not in the sky, not at a considerate altitude. 40 feet above the intersection, which was the height of approximately a 4-story building, and the figure that fell through the breach did not float, or glide, or arrive with any of the atmospheric courtesy that most dimensional crossings employed as a concession to the populations below. It fell. and it landed on the asphalt of the intersection with an impact that cratered the street 2 feet deep, split the pavement in a radial pattern for 15 feet in all directions, set off every car alarm within a city block in the same instant, and produced a sound that the 4 people who witnessed it from close range would describe in the subsequent days as the closest thing they had ever heard to a period being placed at the end of a sentence by something very heavy. The figure stood up. Hell's Kitchen on a Tuesday at 9:47 is never empty. This is New York. The Tuesday evening population of the intersection included a woman walking a terrier, 2 men in the middle of an argument about a restaurant that had closed in 2019, a teenager on a bicycle who had been running a light, and a delivery driver whose vehicle was now the proud owner of 2 flat tires from the pavement debris. They all stopped what they were doing. They all looked. The figure was armored, green-gray, sealed. It looked north, then south, then north again. Then it was still for approximately 3 seconds, the specific stillness of something tracking, something following a signal that other senses would have missed. Then it moved north. The cult on West 52nd Street was not remarkable by Hell's Kitchen's historical standards, which was its own kind of commentary on what Hell's Kitchen's history had accumulated. 17 individuals, an ascending children of the First Father, connected through a sequence of casual overlaps in occult social circles that the NIPD's Organized Crime Division had been attempting to map for 4 months, without understanding what they were looking at. Grade 2 summoning cult, operating under Mephisto's indirect influence, running a ritual that had been in progress for 90 minutes when the Doomslayer turned north. The door was reinforced. The frame was steel. The cult had taken reasonable precautions against the NIPD. They had not taken precautions against the Doomslayer, not because they were careless, but because the category of threat he represented was not in their framework. He walked through the reinforced door. The door went with him for a brief moment, and then it was in the street. The partial infernal manifestation in the center of the ritual circle was the first entity in this universe to register the Doomslayer's presence in the way that infernal entities of every tier, in every dimension the Doomslayer had ever moved through, had registered it, not as a threat to be assessed, not as an obstacle to be overcome or a rival to be managed, as the specific, uncategorizable wrongness of the thing that every demon, in every tradition, has known about and never wanted to find. The entity broke containment, trying to flee. Under normal circumstances, this would have been catastrophic for the 17 individuals present. Under these circumstances, it was irrelevant, because the Doomslayer was faster than the entity's attempt to escape, and what happened in the room in the next 90 seconds was not witnessed by any of the 17 individuals in the room, because every one of them had hit the floor the moment the door came through the wall, and none of them raised their heads until silence had returned and the air had settled. When they raised their heads, the room was empty of everything except themselves. The ritual circle was broken, the candles were out, the manifestation was gone. On the wall above the broken circle, in a medium none of them could identify, there was a mark, not a word, not a symbol, a seal removed. A notation made in a language that had no alphabet, meaning something in the grammar of termination that could be translated, roughly, as done. None of them resumed the cult. It was at the northeast corner of West 52nd Street, 40 seconds after this, that a motorcycle rounded the corner and its rider stopped it dead in the middle of the road. Johnny Blaze had been tracking the cult's energy signature for 11 days. He was patient in that way. He let them develop their ritual to a point that gave him a clean line to Mephisto's hierarchy, a direct connection he could use to send a message that did not require an envelope. He had been doing this, with variations, for most of his adult life. He had gotten good at waiting. He stopped because the building he had been heading for no longer had an active ritual signature. He stopped because the door was in the street. He stopped because the part of his awareness that was not entirely Johnny Blaze, the part that remembered the history of every flame ever lit in the service of infernal punishment, the part that catalogued demonic presence by something older than vision, was doing something it had never done before. It was not tracking the cult's energy. It was not tracking the vanished manifestation. It was tracking the armored figure that had just emerged from the building and was walking north. And what the tracking felt like was not the pull toward sin and debt, and the hierarchy of damnation that it normally oriented toward. It felt like recognition. Johnny Blaze sat on his motorcycle in the middle of West 52nd Street and watched the armored figure walk north, and tried to identify what the sensation in his chest was, and found that the closest word he had for it was kinship. He started the motorcycle and followed. Dr. Strange arrived above Hell's Kitchen 4 minutes later via the sling ring, 12 feet above the impact crater in the intersection, positioned to read the full measure of the situation from the air. The situation was 4 NIPT officers interviewing 17 shaken individuals whose responses were generating the specific facial expressions of law enforcement personnel, receiving information that categorically does not fit their training. A 2-foot crater, and 47 new readings on his handheld monitoring unit, each one the location of a previously active demonic operation in Hell's Kitchen, each one now showing as terminated. Strange descended and began reading environmental data directly. The pavement displacement pattern told him about force applied downward from approximately 12 meters, which was consistent with a high-velocity breach from a dimensional aperture at that altitude. The manner of the door's removal told him about strength that was not mechanical and not sorcerous, a direct physical application that bypassed the door's reinforcement by simply being stronger than the reinforcement. The ritual room, which he entered through the destroyed frame and examined for 6 minutes with the full attention of 30 years of infernal scholarship, told him the most. It told him about how a demonic entity had been terminated in this room, not the energy patterns of a counter-ritual, not the signature of a binding reversed. Something he did not have a reference for, which in 30 years had happened fewer times than he had fingers on one hand. A direct extinguishment, not of the entity's current manifestation, but of something more fundamental, a termination so complete that the ritual circle's binding had not released the entity. The entity had been taken out of the binding entirely, removed from the category of things the binding contained, leaving the circle intact and empty. He reached for his communication amulet. "Tony," he said, before Stark could speak, "I need the team. Tell me there's a threat." "There's something I don't understand," Strange said. "In 30 years of this work, I have learned that that specific combination reliably precedes a very bad week, and I would prefer to have the team assembled before the week becomes apparent, rather than during it." "What kind of something?" Strange looked at the mark on the wall above the broken ritual circle. He had seen references to marks like this in pre-mystical texts, so obscure they did not appear in the Sanctum's primary catalogue, but in the secondary archive of documents acquired from private collections, in passages that several traditions had in common, each one using a different word for the same concept: predator, ender, the one that hunts the hunters, the thing that came before the gods of judgment and does not serve them, something that came from somewhere else, he said, and is doing the work this city needed done, in a way that none of us are equipped to stop, and I want the team here before I decide whether stopping it is the right question. A pause. "I'll get everyone," Stark said. Johnny Blaze followed the Doomslayer for 6 blocks at the distance a careful person maintains with an animal whose temperament has not been fully established. Not so close as to provoke, not so far as to lose the thread. The thread was not visual. It was the flame in the part of him that was not Johnny Blaze, tracking the Doomslayer's movement through the city streets with an attention that was not entirely voluntary. The Doomslayer stopped twice. The first time, there was nothing visible that caused it, and Blaze could only infer from the direction of subsequent movement that something infernal had been detected and logged. The second stop produced a result. A mid-tier demonic entity that had been occupying the basement of a pawn shop on West 54th Street sensed the approach and attempted to flee through the rear wall. The Doomslayer caught it in the alley. 4 seconds. Not sloppy. Not excessive. 4 seconds of applied finality. Precise enough that the structural damage to the alley wall was minimal, and the dumpster 2 feet from the engagement remained upright. Blaze had been doing this work long enough to recognize efficiency. He had also been doing it long enough to recognize something rarer, which was the specific quality of a person who has been doing this for so long that all the questions the work raises have been answered, all the negotiations with doubt have been concluded, all the places where uncertainty lives have been closed off and sealed. Most demon hunters, in Blaze's experience, including himself, operated with a baseline of something that was not quite hesitation, but was the weight of knowing the cost of the work, the cost of the clarity it required, the cost of doing something permanently when the universe's general preference was for provisional, reversible action. The Doomslayer did not operate with that weight. He moved with the specific freedom of someone who had resolved all of those questions so long ago that the resolutions had become structural, had become part of what he was made of, the way old injuries become part of a skeleton. Blaze got off his motorcycle at the entrance to the alley. The Doomslayer turned. In 30 years of demon hunting, Blaze had developed a comprehensive understanding of what his presence registered as in the awareness of various kinds of entities. To the demonic, he was threat or rival depending on tier. To the divine, he was complicated and contextual. To other humans, he was alarming in the ways that someone who occasionally had a skull for a face tended to be alarming. The Doomslayer looked at him with none of those readings. The Doomslayer looked at him the way it had looked at the dimensional membrane before deciding to push through it, with the focused attention of something that was determining whether the thing in front of it was relevant to what it was doing. Blaze said, "Easy, nothing. I'm not a demon," he said. "I know what I look like. I'm not. The part of me that looks like this has been doing what you've been doing tonight for a long time. Different tools, same direction." The helmet was unreadable. The posture was still. "I want to use something I can do," Blaze said. "It's not an attack. It's a question. I want to know who you are." He let the transformation happen. Partial, controlled, not a weapon. The spirit of vengeance rising to the surface as an instrument of perception rather than judgment. The penance stare not directed outward as punishment, but inward as inquiry. A question asked of the soul rather than an indictment leveled at it. He looked into the visor for 3 seconds. Then he stopped. He stood in the alley for a moment without speaking. The penance stare was calibrated to guilt. Guilt was its instrument and its purpose. The measure of accumulated moral debt reflected back at its source with the full amplifying weight of the spirit's judgment. It had never failed to find guilt in anything that carried it. It had found guilt in things that had existed for centuries. It had found guilt in things that did not believe they were capable of it. What it found in the Doomslayer was not guilt. It was grief. Not fresh grief. Not the acute grief of recent loss, but grief that had been present for so long it had become architectural. Grief that was load-bearing. The grief not of a person who had lost something recently, but of someone who had lost something so long ago that the loss had been fully integrated into the structure of the self, had become the foundation on which everything else stood, was no longer distinguishable from who the person was, because there was no longer a version of them that predated it. Grief for a home that was not a place. Grief for a world that no longer existed in the form he had known it. Grief so old it had no moisture left in it, had dried into something hard and structural and permanent, and it had been converted, with complete thoroughness, into the only thing that could be done with it: kill the demons. Kill every demon in every dimension accessible to him, not because it would restore what was lost, not because it would be enough, simply because doing anything else was not acceptable, was not possible, was not a category of action that remained available to whoever was inside the armor. Blaze let the flame down. He stood in the alley and was quiet for a moment. "I understand," he said, very quietly, with the specific tone of a man who has just seen a thing he believed was entirely his own and discovered it is not. He did not say anything else about it. He said, "There's more. There's always more. I know where they are." The Doomslayer looked at him for another second. Then he walked north, toward the next one. Johnny Blaze got on his motorcycle and followed. Not at the safe distance this time, alongside. Strange found them on a rooftop in Midtown at 11:23 p.m., tracking the chain of extinguishments moving north through the borough's infernal infrastructure. Ghost Rider's bike was on the roof. Blaze was at the northeast corner, watching. Strange descended next to him. "How long have you been following him?" 6 blocks, Blaze said. "Then I used the stair." Strange looked at him. "He let me," Blaze said. "Or he didn't stop me. Same thing." He was quiet for a moment. "He's not guilty. He's grief." That's all I've got. He's been doing this longer than us, longer than this universe, maybe. Strange, he's not the threat. He destroyed Mephisto's outer court, Strange said. Blackheart included, Blaze said. A pause. Yes, Blaze said. Strange stood at the edge of the roof and looked at the street below, where the residual traces of 3 separate infernal terminations were still cooling in the ambient mystical environment. Each one a clean extinguishment, no collateral mystical signature, no civilian contamination. He's precise, Strange said. He's practiced, Blaze said. That's different. Strange descended through the building. He found the Doomslayer in the 4th basement level, standing in the ruins of what had been the most sophisticated unauthorized infernal installation in Manhattan in 8 years. 11 months of construction, destroyed. The summoning array that had fed the installation's power, destroyed. The binding stones in the wall, the anchor points that connected the array to Mephisto's hierarchy. The Doomslayer was standing in front of them. Strange landed. The Doomslayer looked at him. "I'm not here to stop you," Strange said. He let a beat pass. "I'm here because I've spent 30 years maintaining the boundary between this world and what you came through, and in 30 years I have never seen anything do what you did to Mephisto's outer court, and I need to understand what you are before I decide what to do about you. Nothing." "The people in this building above us," Strange said. "The people on the street. You've been moving through this city for hours, and none of them have been harmed. That's deliberate. You know they're there. You're not hunting them." He paused. "I need to know that's going to remain true." The Doomslayer raised his hand and touched the binding stones in the wall, not pulling. Something more specific, a direct interference with the infernal binding mechanism, a deactivation that should have required a counter-ritual of considerable complexity and instead appeared to require, in this case, only direct contact and a form of will that Strange could not classify but could recognize as purposeful. The stones went dark. The Doomslayer placed them on the floor, carefully, not dropped, placed. Strange looked at the stones. "You know what those are," he said, "and you know what leaving them active would mean." The Doomslayer turned toward the stairs. "Wait," not a command. "There are more of them, across the city, across the country, layers of this. And I have maps." The Doomslayer stopped. Strange produced the maps from the Sanctum's archive, rendered in 3-dimensional form, the infernal infrastructure of North America, resolved layer by layer. Active installations, dormant summoning sites, cult operations, entities in residence, ranked by tier and connection to Mephisto's hierarchy. The work of 7 years of monitoring, condensed into something you could hold in the air between 2 people. The Doomslayer studied the maps. 60 seconds of absolute stillness, the focused attention of something processing tactical information through frameworks Strange could not follow. Strange watched him study them and tried to read the process and could not. He could read only that it was happening and that it was thorough. Then the Doomslayer looked up. He held Strange's gaze for a moment that Strange would spend considerable time thinking about in the days that followed. Then he turned and moved toward the stairs, and the direction he took on the street corresponded exactly to the location of the highest-tier active installation on Strange's map, which was 112 miles north, in Connecticut. Strange returned to the roof. "He took the maps," he said. Blaze stared at him. "I know," Strange said. "I know what I did, but he was going to find them anyway. He found 47 installations in 3 hours without assistance. The question is not whether Mephisto's North American infrastructure survives this. The question is whether the people near his path do." Mephisto had been watching. He had watched from his inner sanctum through the monitoring altar, which had survived the clearing of his court because the inner sanctum's wards had survived, and he had watched the Doomslayer move through his realm and through his membrane and into his North American infrastructure with the attention of a general watching a campaign that has already been decided and is now only a matter of determining what the final cost will be. He had not sent anything after the Doomslayer, not in the realm and not on Earth. Everything he had sent in the realm had been removed from existence, and 10,000 years of applied intelligence was more than sufficient to recognize that the pattern was not going to change. The Doomslayer was not a conventional problem. He did not have a conventional solution. What he had was the archive. The archive was the single most comprehensive record of human failure in any dimension Mephisto was aware of. It was not a record of souls traded or contracts signed. Those were the business records, the ledgers, the documentation of formal transactions. The archive was something else, the observation record, 60 centuries of watching humanity in its most unguarded moments, the moments where what people told themselves about themselves diverged most sharply from what they actually were. He did not need to hurt the Avengers, he needed to slow them down. Slow them down by the specific number of minutes required for him to reach the Connecticut facility before the Doomslayer, set the terms of the space, and have the conversation that he intended to have. He selected his instruments carefully. Tony Stark was in the Quinjet crossing Long Island Sound when the clarity arrived. Not a vision, not a supernatural intrusion he could identify and resist, simply a sudden, total, unwanted lucidity about a set of decisions he had been carrying for 15 years in the specific way that self-aware, competent people carry things they cannot put down, which was by being aware of them at a constant low level while never looking directly. The indirect awareness allowed them to be managed, the direct clarity did not. He saw them directly. He did not crash the Quinjet. He was a better pilot than that, but he was silent for 40 seconds, and 40 seconds of silence from Tony Stark was something Steve Rogers noted with the precision of long familiarity. Rogers received his own delivery 4 seconds later, not guilt. Rogers carried his failures differently than Stark. Rogers was a man who had been right about things, consistently, across a career defined by principled refusal to compromise on what he believed. And the particular quality of a man who has sacrificed other people's options for the sake of his own convictions, and has called this righteousness because calling it anything else was not available to him, that quality was exactly the texture Mephisto needed. He gripped the armrest and looked out the window, and what was on his face, for those 7 seconds, was not anything he had been prepared to feel. Strange recognized the intervention the moment it landed, not because he was immune to it, but because 30 years of studying Mephisto had made the mechanism recognizable even when it was working on him. He felt it as a kind of gravity, the specific weight of old decisions being given new angles, and he set it aside with the practiced effort of someone who had done this before and was going to need to do it again. "Mephisto," he said into his amulet. "He's using the archive. Don't engage with it. It will pass in approximately 6 minutes." Thor received nothing. Mephisto had assessed him and filed the intervention under later, because Thor's relationship with his failures was fuel, and amplifying fuel was counterproductive when you were trying to slow someone down. The Quinjet lost 4 minutes to the intervention, which was exactly what Mephisto had calculated he needed. The Connecticut facility was a manor house in the hills outside Litchfield, registered under a holding company, occupied for 40 years by residents who did not exist, and known to Strange's monitoring system as the location of Mephisto's primary North American anchor binding. The binding was 40 years of construction, woven by Mephisto himself into the foundational dimensional substrate of the region, a mechanism so deeply embedded that removing it was not a matter of counter-ritual, but of restructuring the substrate itself, which was why Strange had known it was there for 6 years and had not attempted to remove it. It was also why he had not included it on the map he gave the Doomslayer. The Doomslayer had found it anyway. The manor's perimeter was guarded by a ring of 12 bound gargoyles, each one a mid-tier demonic entity warded for human-scale threats. They activated when the Doomslayer entered the tree line and engaged when he reached the perimeter. The engagement lasted 3 minutes, which was longer than any single engagement since his arrival. The geometry was the problem, not the opponents. 12 entities approaching from multiple vectors simultaneously required a response that was distributed rather than focused, and the distribution came at a cost, not in capacity, but in damage taken. 2 of the engagements were not clean. The Doomslayer accepted the hits to maintain forward momentum, because stopping was not a parameter he operated with. The armor absorbed the damage and recorded it in the language that armor keeps, new abrasions joining old ones, the record growing longer. He reached the manor's front door. He opened it. Inside, The manor had been allowed to be what it was, not the tasteful exterior of a Connecticut property, but an infernal facility of considerable sophistication, the walls lined with dimensional architecture that hummed with the energy flowing through the anchor binding below. The hum was a frequency Strange knew, had monitored for 6 years, had documented in 3 separate research papers on infernal infrastructure design that he had filed in the Sanctum's restricted archive. Strange came through a portal behind the Doomslayer 1 second after entry. Ghost Rider came through the window. Thor and Stark and Rogers were in the Quinjet, circling, Strange's instruction holding them outside. The instruction was, wait for the signal. The instruction was holding, but Strange was aware it had a limited lifespan. Mephisto was in the manor's central chamber at the end of a long corridor through 3 warded rooms, and he was in his negotiating form, which Strange had seen enough times to read the way a trained observer reads a known dialect: tall, red, aristocratic, the specific affect of a man for whom every conversation has ended in his favor. He looked at the Doomslayer and said, with the warmth of a host receiving a guest he has been expecting, "Welcome to Earth. You've done remarkable work tonight. I want you to know I hold no grievance." The Doomslayer walked toward him. "I can send you home," Mephisto said. The Doomslayer stopped. Strange stepped forward from the corridor. Mephisto looked at him with the expression of someone prepared for a complication. "Don't," Strange said. Not to Mephisto, to the Doomslayer. The Doomslayer did not look at him. He was looking at Mephisto. "He's offering a transaction," Strange said. "That's his instrument. He offers what you want in exchange for what he wants, which is for you to leave, because you are the only thing in this universe that he cannot negotiate with, cannot outlast, cannot buy, and cannot fight. And if you take the door, everything you've done tonight rebuilds in 3 months. The infrastructure is patient, the cults reform, the anchor binding in the basement of this building remains intact, and every secondary installation that depends on it comes back." He paused. "I know that's not your war," Strange said. His voice did not carry anything performative. It carried the plain weight of what he was about to say, which he had not planned to say, and was saying anyway because it was true, and the moment required truth more than strategy. "I know you have a war somewhere else, and it's ongoing, and every hour you spend here is an hour the things you were supposed to be hunting are operating without opposition. I know what I'm asking." He met the visor. "I'm asking anyway, because I've been holding this boundary for 30 years and I am tired, and the thing in the basement of this building is beyond what I can address alone, and I think you can address it." Silence. 5 seconds. The Doomslayer turned back to Mephisto, and Mephisto's composure shifted, slightly, not fear. The very specific recognition of a man who has spent 10,000 years operating exclusively through transaction that a transaction is not available, which meant the fallback was required. The fallback that he had believed, with the calm certainty of extreme age, would never actually be necessary. He made himself what he was. The infernal energy in the manor's walls answered him, the entire accumulated force of 40 years of anchor binding activating at once, the manor's interior collapsing the distinction between itself and Mephisto's realm, the ceiling becoming something other than a ceiling, and the walls becoming something other than walls, and Mephisto, at the center of it all, becoming what 10,000 years of accumulated infernal power actually looked like when it stopped choosing to appear manageable. Ghost Rider was not in the corridor. Ghost Rider had been moving through the manor's left flank since the moment Strange stepped forward to speak, because the strategy discussed briefly in the Quinjet was not Strange engaging Mephisto in argument until an outcome was determined. The strategy was, Strange talks, Ghost Rider moves, the Doomslayer does what he was always going to do. The chain of the rider lit the basement blue-white as it swung into the anchor binding's primary matrix. The binding was 40 years old, and woven by Mephisto himself into the foundational substrate of the region, and it was, by any reasonable measure, more resilient than one demon hunter could overcome. The rider brought the chain against it anyway, because the chain was not a chain. It was the penance stare given physical form, judgment made into fire, and what the anchor binding contained was the precise kind of accumulated sin the chain existed to consume. 60 centuries of infernal transaction, Soul debt woven into dimensional architecture, the compressed weight of every compromise and corruption and conscious cruelty that had fed the binding strength across 4 decades. The chain found all of it. The binding fractured. Above, the infernal extension Mephisto had imposed on the manor shuddered. The borrowed sky flickered. The walls stuttered between Connecticut and something older. The Doomslayer moved, not toward the walls, toward Mephisto. Through the heat and the ancient dark that the demon lord had assembled, through the borrowed landscape of a realm stripped of 3/4 of its court and now stripped of its anchor, Mephisto diminished even as he towered, the scale of him contingent on infrastructure that the chain in the basement was consuming one binding strand at a time. What the Doomslayer did in the next 4 minutes was not recorded by any instrument. Strange watched it from the corridor doorway, and the word he reached for in the report he filed 3 days later was not combat. The word he reached for was demolition, the removal of something that had been wrongly placed, precise, sustained, without interruption or hesitation or any moment of reassessment, because reassessment requires that some part of you is still determining whether the thing in front of you requires a different approach. The Doomslayer had made that determination about things like Mephisto in a dimension that no longer existed, and the determination had not changed. The first strike landed on something that had not been struck in 4 centuries. Mephisto had not been physically hurt in 400 years. The last entity that managed it was gone, a footnote in his private archive, a story he told himself occasionally as evidence that some things could be ended. He had not experienced that story from the position of the thing being reminded until this moment, and the experience was clarifying in a way that 10,000 years had not prepared him for. The second strike collapsed the primary manifestation, not destroyed. Mephisto could not be destroyed from a single location. He was distributed across his entire realm, and the realm persisted. What could be ended was his presence here, his invested power, his North American construction, his 40-year anchor, his court, his infrastructure, his ability to anchor a manifestation of this magnitude in the mortal plane. All of that ended in a sequence of blows that the broken instruments in the outer sanctum of the Sanctum Sanctorum could not have measured, even if they had been intact. The final blow landed on a form already withdrawing, already contracting toward the dimensional boundary, and what it did was sever the connection that had allowed the manifestation to sustain itself in the mortal plane. The manifestation snapped back. The manor was quiet. Connecticut again, old hardwood floor, faded wallpaper, a ceiling that was simply a ceiling. The Doomslayer stood in the center of it. The armor recorded the manor's engagement in new gouges and stress fractures that joined the old ones, the record longer now by 1 more night. Strange came through the corridor doorway. "Thank you," he said. "Nothing." "I know you didn't do it for us," Strange said. "I know you did it because it was there, and it was the next thing. But the effect is the same." Ghost Rider came up from the basement stairs, chain cooling. "Bindings down," he said. "Clean. It's going to take him years to rebuild that." Strange looked at the room. "Decades," he said. "Without Blackheart, without the outer court, without the anchor." He was quiet for a moment. "Decades." The sun came up over New York City with the indifference cities generate in people who have been awake all night, the light arriving for someone else, the world's renewal a fact about the world and not a gift to anyone in it. Dr. Strange stood in the outer sanctum of the Sanctum Sanctorum and looked at what the rebuilt monitoring matrix was showing. The infernal infrastructure of the northeastern United States looked, for the first time in 30 years of his watching it, like a map from which something had been removed. The active installations were gone. The cult operations were terminated. The anchor binding was absent from the substrate like a tooth pulled clean. Dormant sites remained, as they always would, because dormancy was not destruction. But the living web was not living. Elias Orn sat at his station and looked at the readings and said, "It will come back." "Yes," Strange said, "but not for a while. Not for a while." Elias was quiet. "What do we do about him?" Strange had thought about this on the drive back from Connecticut, made in a borrowed car, slowly, because sometimes moving slowly through a changed landscape was the only adequate response to it. "We don't do anything about him. He's not ours to do anything about. He'll continue. He'll work through the maps. When there's nothing left of Mephisto's infrastructure to find, he'll find a way home, or he'll find something else. He turned from the instruments. We follow behind and make sure the people near his path are protected. And if someone gets hurt, then we deal with it, Strange said, imperfectly, after the fact, grateful the mistake wasn't larger. He paused. He hasn't made one yet. Tony Stark spent the flight back to New York not speaking. He had looked at the Doomslayer crossing that facility and understood, with the kind of clarity that costs something to hold, the difference between relentlessness practiced and relentlessness structural. He had believed, before tonight, that he understood what it meant to not stop. He understood now that what he had been practicing was a daily decision, made and remade, carried forward through the friction of doubt and the negotiation with limits and the ongoing cost of being someone who had not resolved all the questions yet. The Doomslayer had resolved them so long ago that the resolutions had become load-bearing. There was no space left in the structure for the negotiation. Tony did not know whether that was something to want or something to grieve, and suspected the answer was both, and that the Doomslayer had arrived at the same answer and simply stopped asking. Steve Rogers did not speak either. He looked out the opposite window and thought about certainty. He had been certain about things. He had been right about them. He had paid for being right in ways he had catalogued as the price of principle, which was a catalogue he had maintained with care, because naming the cost was the only way to make the cost meaningful. Tonight he had felt the shape of his certainty from the outside, and what it felt like from the outside was not righteousness. It felt like something closer to what the Doomslayer was. It felt like a self from which all alternatives had been removed, not by choice, but by duration, by the grinding away of options until only the right one remained. He was going to need to think about that for a while. He was going to need to think about whether the distinction mattered. Johnny Blaze took the back roads from Connecticut, 2-lane routes through the hills, and let the morning come up around him, and thought about the grief so old it had become structural, and thought about whether he was looking at a future or a mirror. He decided it did not matter in a practical sense. The work was the work. The morning was the morning. The next demon was wherever the next demon was. He accelerated onto the on-ramp and let the city close around him. In Mephisto's realm, diminished and intact, the demon lord sat at his monitoring altar and watched the reading that corresponded to the Doomslayer's position on Earth move steadily south through New Jersey, following the map Strange had provided. The reading was patient, consistent, unhurried. Mephisto was 10,000 years old. He had recovered from things that lesser entities would not have survived. He would recover from this. His court would restock, given time. The anchor binding would be rebuilt, given time and resources, and the careful avoidance of whatever path led back to that manor house. Blackheart was a more complex problem. He filed it under private archive, and closed the entry and did not open it again. He looked at the moving reading for a long time. "What are you?" he said, not asking the room, not asking himself, asking the reading, asking the thing moving steadily south through New Jersey, with no more interest in being asked the question than it had in answering it. The reading moved, south, steady, patient, following the map. In a universe where mercy was a practice, where the most monstrous were occasionally redeemed, where second chances were extended to things that had not earned them, because the alternative was a brutality too close to what they fought against. A single figure in green-gray armor moved through the spaces between the mercy and the mercy's cost, doing the work the mercy had not done, clearing the ground the mercy had left occupied, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without any interest in being understood. He was not a soldier in this war. He was not anyone's soldier. He had arrived and found demons and done the only thing he knew, which was also the only thing required of him, which was also the only thing available to him, which was also, beneath the armor and the grief and the centuries of function, the only thing left of the person he had once been before the world, that made him ended and left only this. In the grim machinery of a universe that ran on narrative, on stakes and choices and the drama of what could go either way, the Doomslayer was a third thing. Not mercy, not judgment, something older than both, something that preceded the gods of punishment and owed them nothing. In the night, in New Jersey, in the cold pre-dawn dark that smelled of diesel and river water and the ordinary commerce of a world that had no idea what was moving through it, he stopped at the location on the map. He assessed the building, he went in. And in his ruined realm, beside his private monitoring altar, on the last page of the oldest catalogue he kept, Mephisto wrote 2 words in a hand that had not trembled in 4,000 years. He wrote, "The Hell Walker." He closed the book. He did not open it again.